The gasp from the crowd was a sharp collective intake of breath, a sound quickly swallowed by a wave of stunned silence, then horrified murmurs. On stage, under the warm glow of the spotlights, little Danny Miller, all of 10 years old, and radiating a nervous excitement that had been utterly captivating, moments before was no longer gliding his wheelchair in the intricate, joyful patterns he'd so clearly rehearsed. Instead, his small customized chair lay on its side, one wheel spinning uselessly. Danny himself was splayed on the polished wooden stage, his face a mask of shock and dawning pain, his brightly colored costume, a superhero of his own design, twisted beneath him. And there at the edge of the stage, panting slightly, her face a grotesque contortion of fury and self-righteousness, stood a woman. She was middle-aged, dressed in expensive but severe clothing, her hand still outstretched, as if she'd just completed a distasteful but necessary task. Her voice, shrill and carrying clearly over the suddenly silent auditorium, pierced the stunned air. "This is an embarrassment, a complete embarrassment to the competition. He shouldn't be allowed," making a mockery of it all. My blood ran cold. I was standing just off stage, left near the emergency exit, my official lanyard, with its federal insignia tucked discreetly inside my jacket, but readily accessible. My name is Alex Jordan, and I'm a senior inspector for the Federal Office of Public Event Integrity and Safety. My job is to ensure that events like this, the State Youth Talent Showcase, held in a facility that receives substantial federal funding, adhere to all safety, accessibility, and civil rights regulations. What I had just witnessed was not a simple accident. It was a deliberate, violent act of aggression, a public assault on a disabled child in the middle of his performance. Danny had been a revelation. His act, titled Wheels of Wonder, was a unique blend of choreographed wheelchair movement, expressive dance with his upper body, and a stunning projected backdrop that changed with the music telling a story of flight and freedom. He'd been nervous backstage, his small hands gripping the joystick of his chair, his mother whispering encouragement. But once on stage, he had transformed. He was confident, graceful, his joy infectious. The audience had been spellbound, until she intervened. I was already moving before the woman had finished her pronouncement. My training years of it kicked in. Assess threat, ensure victim safety, secure perpetrator control scene. I signaled to the two nearest venue security guards, young men who looked as stunned as everyone else, with a sharp, universally understood gesture: stage now. Her. As I strode towards the woman, who was now attempting to turn back towards the audience, as if expecting applause for her heinous act, I could hear Danny begin to cry, a thin, frightened wail that cut through the murmurs and gasps. His mother was already rushing from the wings, her face a mask of anguish. "Ma'am." My voice was low, authoritative, cutting through her attempt to address the audience. "Stay right where you are." She whirled around, her eyes narrowed and hostile, fixing on me. "And who are you?" she demanded, her tone laced with arrogance. I was 3 feet from her now. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my credentials, holding the badge up clearly. Alex Jordan, Federal Event Inspector. "You are being detained for assault and deliberate disruption of a public event in a federally regulated institution." Her jaw dropped. The color drained from her face, replaced by a mottled red flush of disbelief and outrage. Federal assault. "Don't be ridiculous. I barely touched him. He's clearly unstable if a little nudge sends him flying. This whole display is what's an embarrassment." This was the hook, the moment the bright promise of a talent show was shattered by an act of profound cruelty, the moment my routine inspection escalated into a federal incident, the moment a woman's venomous prejudice manifested as a physical attack on a vulnerable child. My setup for being at the Heston Memorial Auditorium that Saturday was standard procedure. The State Youth Talent Showcase was a major annual event drawing participants and audiences from across the state. The auditorium itself, a grand old building recently renovated with a mix of state and federal grants, fell under my agency's purview for compliance checks. My day had started hours before the curtain rose with a thorough inspection of the facility emergency exits, clear and accessible fire suppression systems, operational backstage areas, secure ADA compliance for both audience and performers verified. I'd reviewed security staffing, communication protocols, and contingency plans for everything from a medical emergency to a power outage. It was meticulous, often tedious work, but essential for ensuring the safety and equal access of everyone involved. I'd even had a brief, pleasant interaction with Danny and his mother Amelia Miller backstage during the final walkthrough. Danny, small for his age with bright, intelligent eyes and a shy smile, had proudly shown me the custom LED lights on his wheelchair spokes. He used the chair due to a condition called osteogenesis imperfecta brittle bone disease, which meant any fall, any undue impact could have severe consequences. He'd told me, his voice full of hopeful anticipation. My act is about showing that wheelchairs aren't just for getting around. They can be part of the art. They can be super. His enthusiasm was infectious. Amelia, a gentle woman with tired eyes but a fierce love for her son, had thanked me for ensuring the stage ramp was properly installed and secure. It means the world to him to be able to do this independently, she'd said, her voice thick with emotion. In contrast, I'd also noticed the woman who had just assaulted Danny. I'll call her Eleanor Vance, as I learned her name soon enough. She'd been backstage earlier, loudly complaining to an event organizer about the dressing room assignments for her daughter, a ballet dancer. Her voice was grating, her demeanor demanding. Later in the lobby, I'd overheard her making disparaging remarks to another parent about the inclusionary nonsense of some of the acts. It's supposed to be a talent show, not a pity party, she'd sniffed. At the time, I'd filed it away as unpleasant but not actionable bigotry, a reminder of the undercurrents of prejudice that still existed. I had not for a moment imagined she would escalate to physical violence. The inciting incident, Eleanor Vance's charge onto the stage, her hateful words, and the deliberate shove that sent Danny and his wheelchair toppling, was a shocking breach of every conceivable standard of decency and safety. It was a physical assault, yes, but it was also an attack on Danny's dignity, his courage, and the very spirit of the event. The two venue security guards, galvanized by my command, flanked Eleanor Vance. She sputtered, "Get your hands off me, I know my rights. My husband is a very important lawyer." "Your rights do not include assaulting a child, Miss Vance," I stated calmly, though my heart was pounding with a mixture of professional adrenaline and personal outrage. I gestured to one of the guards. "Escort her to the security office. Do not leave her unattended. I will be there shortly. Confiscate her phone as potential evidence." My immediate priority was Danny. Paramedics already on standby for the event, as per protocol, were on stage within seconds. Amelia was kneeling beside her son, her face streaked with tears, trying to comfort him. Danny was crying, not just from pain, but from humiliation and fear. The bright superhero cape he wore was tangled around his legs. The vibrant projections he'd controlled with a small device on his armrest had frozen into a chaotic jumble of colors on the screen behind him. "Danny, can you tell me where it hurts?" one of the paramedics asked gently. He whimpered, cradling his left wrist. "My arm and my head." I hit my head. I did a quick visual assessment. No obvious bleeding from the head, but the way he was holding his wrist was concerning, and any head injury in a child with his condition was serious. The fall had been hard. The event manager, a flustered man named Greg Henderson, rushed over to me, his face ashen. "Inspector Jordan, this is a disaster. Unprecedented. What do we do? Should we stop the show?" "The show is secondary right now, Mr. Henderson," I said firmly. "Your primary concern is the child's welfare and securing the scene. I need a clear path for the paramedics to evacuate him to the ambulance. I also need a complete list of all accredited media present and any unaccredited individuals seen filming the incident. We need to control the narrative before it spins out of control with misinformation." My mind was already working on the chain of custody for evidence witness statements and the official report I would have to file. Eleanor Vance, being led away, was still shouting, "This is an outrage. I demand to speak to my lawyer. You people are protecting this charade." Her voice was finally muffled as they guided her through a backstage door. The first stage of the rising action unfolded in the chaotic hour that followed. Danny was carefully stabilized and transported to the nearest hospital, Amelia accompanying him, her face a mask of stoic grief. The talent show was temporarily halted. The audience was a sea of shocked faces, many people recording on their phones, others comforting crying children. I directed venue staff to begin taking preliminary statements from witnesses near the stage. In the cramped security office, Eleanor Vance was incandescent with rage. She refused to answer any questions, instead launching into a tirade about declining standards, political correctness gone mad, and how Danny's act was deeply inappropriate and disturbing for other children to watch. "Ms. Vance," I said, keeping my voice even professional, despite the contempt I felt. "You intentionally pushed a disabled child off the stage in the middle of his performance. That is a criminal act. You are currently detained pending the arrival of local law enforcement, to whom I will be recommending charges of assault and battery, possibly with hate crime enhancements, given your statements and the victim's protected status." "Hate crime?" She scoffed. "That's absurd. I was exercising my right to protest something offensive. He was an embarrassment to the genuine talent in this show. My daughter Clarissa has trained for years in classical ballet. She deserves to compete against real talent, not this sideshow." Her utter lack of remorse, her doubling down on her disgusting justifications, was chilling. She genuinely believed she was in the right, that her prejudice gave her license to commit violence. It was clear she saw Danny not as a child, not as a performer, but as an object of her disdain, an affront to her narrow worldview. The local police arrived 2 patrol officers initially. I briefed them on the situation, provided my credentials, and handed over my initial incident report. I emphasized the federal interest due to the venue's funding and the potential violation of civil rights statutes. They were initially hesitant, clearly unsure how to handle a federal inspector and an incident of this nature at such a high-profile event. One of them, a younger officer, seemed inclined to treat it as a simple misdemeanor, perhaps a disorderly conduct charge. "Look, Inspector," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "She's obviously upset, maybe a bit unhinged. But a federal case for a shove? Isn't that a bit much?" This was the pushback I'd anticipated, the tendency to downplay, to minimize, especially when the perpetrator was a well-dressed, articulate white woman and the victim was from a marginalized group. "Officer," I replied, my tone brooking no argument. "This shove, as you call it, was an unprovoked attack on a disabled minor on stage in a public institution that receives federal funds. It caused physical injury and extreme emotional distress. It also appears to be motivated by discriminatory animus, which potentially elevates it to a hate crime under both state and federal law. My agency takes such matters extremely seriously. I expect her to be booked accordingly." The officer exchanged a look with his partner, who nodded curtly. The gravity of the situation and my insistence was beginning to sink in. Eleanor Vance was read her Miranda rights and formally arrested. As she was led away in handcuffs, still protesting her innocence and threatening lawsuits, a small grim satisfaction settled in me. This was just the first step. The second shocking incident in the rising action came swiftly fueled by the inevitable media frenzy and Eleanor Vance's attempts to manipulate the narrative from behind the scenes. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. Talent show terror disabled. Boy attacked on stage. Initial reports were sensationalized but generally sympathetic to Danny. However, within 24 hours, a counter-narrative began to emerge, seeded by anonymous online comments and then amplified by certain fringe media outlets. Eleanor Vance, having posted bail through her affluent husband's connections, had hired a high-powered PR firm and a notoriously aggressive defense attorney. Suddenly, articles appeared questioning Danny's suitability for the competition. Anonymous witnesses claimed Danny had been unstable in his wheelchair or that his act had been provocative. Eleanor herself gave a tearful, carefully coached interview to a sympathetic blogger, painting herself as a concerned mother who had instinctively reacted to a dangerous situation on stage, implying Danny had been about to fall anyway, and she had merely tried to help or shield other children from a distressing sight. She claimed she had tripped and that any contact was accidental. It was a masterclass in victim blaming and gaslighting. The online commentary turned vicious. Ableist trolls crawled out from under their rocks, spewing hatred towards Danny and his family, praising Eleanor for her bravery. Some even accused Amelia of exploiting her son's disability for attention. The sheer volume of vitriol was sickening. At the same time, I began to feel pressure from within the system. My direct superior at the Federal Office of Public Event Integrity and Safety, a cautious man named Director Harrison, called me. "Alex," he said, his voice tight with concern. "This Vance situation is blowing up. The optics are terrible. Her husband has connections. He's already threatening lawsuits against the department, against you personally, for false arrest defamation. Are you absolutely sure about the hate crime angle? Is your evidence solid? The secretary's office is getting calls. Director, I replied firmly. I witnessed the assault myself. Her statements at the scene and her subsequent public pronouncements demonstrate clear discriminatory animus. Danny Miller's act was not dangerous. It was inspiring. Ms. Vance's actions were deliberate and malicious. The fact that she's wealthy and connected doesn't change the facts, nor does it negate our responsibility to uphold federal civil rights protections, especially for disabled individuals in federally funded public spaces. I understand, Alex, and I appreciate your commitment, but we need to be careful. This could become a political minefield. Local DA is handling the assault charges. Perhaps we should let them take the lead monitor from a distance. With all due respect, Director, I countered this falls squarely within our mandate. Interference with a disabled individual's right to participate in and enjoy the benefits of a public program receiving federal assistance is a federal offense. Her actions created a hostile environment and denied Danny Miller that right in the most violent way. If we back down now, what message does that send? There was a pause. All right, Alex, proceed with your investigation. But be meticulous. Every I dotted, every T crossed. I expect a full report on my desk by the end of the week. And Alex, watch your back. The warning was clear. Eleanor Vance was not just some random enraged parent. She had resources, and she was prepared to use them to destroy anyone who stood in her way. The fight was becoming more complex, more dangerous. The first layer of the midpoint twist began to emerge as I delved deeper into Eleanor Vance's background, using official channels and interagency cooperation. This wasn't just about getting her CV. This was about building a profile of her behavior, her attitudes, and any prior incidents. What I found was disturbing, though, perhaps not entirely surprising. Eleanor Vance had a documented history of aggressive behavior and complaints related to ableism. There were records from her children's exclusive private school detailing several confrontations with staff regarding accommodations for students with learning disabilities whom she had termed a drain on resources and unfair distractions for normal children. She had led a campaign against the school's participation in an inclusive sports program. There were also police reports from her upscale suburban town, minor incidents that never led to charges, but painted a picture of public outburst at a library storytime that included a child with Down syndrome, a heated argument with a disabled veteran over a handicapped parking space she had partially blocked. She had even penned several letters to the editor of her local newspaper using pseudonyms, railing against the tyranny of political correctness and what she called the glorification of weakness. More chillingly, I discovered through social media forensics, cross-referencing her known associates and online footprint, that she was an administrator for a private online forum dedicated to preserving traditional values in youth activities. The forum was a cesspool of thinly veiled bigotry, with threads disparaging inclusive casting in school plays, mocking special needs athletics, and promoting the idea that children with disabilities should be sheltered and kept out of the public eye for their own good and the comfort of others. Her digital footprint revealed a deep-seated prejudice, a belief that people with disabilities were somehow lesser and embarrassment to be hidden away or at best tolerated only if they didn't draw attention to themselves. Danny's joyful, confident, attention-grabbing performance was a direct affront to her worldview. This wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment on stage. This was a pattern. Eleanor Vance was a serial perpetrator of ableist harassment, and the talent show was simply the latest, most public venue for her hateful ideology to manifest. The second layer of the twist, the one that elevated this from a pattern of bigotry to something more concretely damning in a legal sense, came from an unexpected source, a disgruntled former member of Eleanor Vance's inner circle. As the media storm around the talent show incident continued with Vance's PR machine working overtime to paint her as a misunderstood victim, a woman named Sarah Beth Compton contacted our agency's tip line. She identified herself as a former friend of Eleanor's and a fellow parent at her daughter Clarissa's ballet school. She stated she had information relevant to the assault on Danny Miller. I met with Ms. Compton in a discreet location. She was nervous, clearly conflicted, but also resolute. Eleanor, She's become unhinged. Ms. Compton began, her voice trembling slightly. She always had these opinions. But it's gotten worse. After Clarissa didn't get the lead in the spring recital last year, it went to a wonderfully talented girl who happens to use crutches. Eleanor became obsessed. She started this online group. She calls it Parents for Artistic Purity. It sounds noble, but it's just ugly. Then came the bombshell. The night before the state talent showcase, Ms. Compton continued, her eyes filled with a mixture of shame and determination. We were at Eleanor's house. A few of us. Clarissa was upset because she'd heard Danny Miller's act was really something special, and she was worried about the competition. Eleanor said, and I quote, "Don't you worry your pretty little head, darling. That little cripple won't be stealing anyone's spotlight tomorrow. I'll make sure of it. I'll create such a scene they'll have to disqualify him, or he'll be too humiliated to continue. People need to understand these shows are for real talent, not for charity cases." Ms. Compton explained that Eleanor had even mused about accidentally tripping near the stage or creating a loud disturbance during his specific act. She hadn't detailed an outright physical assault, but the premeditated intent to disrupt, to humiliate, to ensure Danny could not succeed was undeniable. Ms. Compton had been horrified, but too intimidated to say anything at the time. The actual assault on Danny, however, had been a wake-up call for her. She provided a detailed signed affidavit. She also mentioned that Eleanor had often boasted about how her husband's legal prowess could make any problem disappear. This was it. This was the evidence of premeditation, of malice aforethought. This transformed the case from a possible impulsive act of bigotry, though still criminal, to a calculated plan to interfere with a disabled child's participation in a public event motivated by discriminatory animus. It strengthened the hate crime argument immensely and painted Eleanor Vance not as a misguided woman who snapped, but as a calculating manipulator who had planned to cause harm. Armed with this comprehensive evidence, the eyewitness accounts, the video footage from the auditorium, which I had formally requisitioned and which clearly showed Eleanor's deliberate approach and shove, contradicting her tripping claim, her documented history of ableist behavior, her online activities, and now Ms. Compton's damning affidavit. I finalized my federal report. The case against Eleanor Vance was overwhelming. The climax was set for a special public hearing convened by the State Commission on Public Institutions and Civil Rights, a body with oversight over events like the talent showcase. The hearing was called in response to the massive public outcry and the federal investigation. It was to review the incident, the security protocols of the event, and to hear testimony regarding Ms. Vance's actions. The hearing was televised locally, and national news outlets sent correspondents. The pressure was immense. The hearing room was packed. Danny and his mother, Amelia, were present, seated in the front row, along with their lawyer. Danny looked small and vulnerable, his arm in a brightly colored cast, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. Eleanor Vance sat at a table with her legal team, her expression carefully neutral, though a vein throbbed visibly in her temple. Director Harrison was there, as were representatives from the State Attorney General's office. I was the first to testify. I laid out the facts, calmly and methodically. I presented the timeline of events, detailed Eleanor Vance's actions, and showed the key video clips of the assault. Gasps rippled through the room as the audience saw in stark clarity the violence of the push and Danny's subsequent fall. I then detailed her statements at the scene, her lack of remorse, and the evidence of her prior ableist conduct and online activities. Finally, I presented the information from Sarah Beth Compton's affidavit outlining the premeditated nature of Vance's intent to disrupt Danny's performance. Eleanor Vance's actions. I concluded, my voice ringing with conviction, were not merely a breach of decorum or a momentary lapse of judgment. They were a calculated discriminatory assault on a disabled child designed to silence and humiliate him and to deny him his federally protected right to participate fully and equally in a public event. This was an act of hate, plain and simple, and it demands the full response of the law, both state and federal. Eleanor Vance's lawyer attempted to discredit me, to paint me as an overzealous federal agent with a vendetta. He tried to dismiss Ms. Compton's testimony as hearsay from a disgruntled former friend. He reiterated Vance's claim that she had tripped, that it was an accident, that her online comments were taken out of context, that she was the true victim of a media witch hunt. But the evidence was too strong. The video footage was irrefutable. Ms. Compton, when called to testify, was steadfast and credible, her voice shaking, but her testimony unwavering. Other witnesses from the talent show corroborated the sequence of events and Vance's hateful statements. Then Danny Miller, with the assistance of his mother, was invited to give an impact statement. He didn't speak from his wheelchair. Instead, with Amelia's help, he stood on his own 2 feet, leaning heavily on a pair of crutches, his casted arm held carefully across his chest. His voice was small, but it filled the hushed room. "My name is Danny Miller," he began. "I'm 10 years old. I love to dance with my wheelchair. My act was about showing that being different doesn't mean you can't be strong or fly or be a superhero. When Ms. Vance pushed me, I was scared. My arm hurt and my head hurt, but mostly my heart hurt, because she didn't even know me and she hated me. She tried to make me feel small and ashamed and like I didn't belong." He paused, taking a shaky breath, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing on Eleanor Vance. "But I'm not ashamed, and I do belong, and I will dance again. You didn't stop me. You just made me want to try even harder." A wave of emotion swept through the room. Tears streamed down many faces. Even some of the commission members looked visibly moved. Eleanor Vance, for the first time, looked away, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking. The falling action began with the commission's swift and unequivocal condemnation of Eleanor Vance. They recommended that the state attorney general pursue all available charges to the fullest extent of the law, and they formally requested that the U.S. Department of Justice, based on my agency's findings, initiate its own civil rights investigation. The legal consequences for Eleanor Vance were severe. She was charged by the state with felony assault on a child and battery with a hate crime enhancement. Simultaneously, the Department of Justice filed federal charges for violation of Danny Miller's civil rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act, specifically for interference with his right to participate in a public program and for committing a bias-motivated act of violence. Her high-powered legal team fought vigorously, attempting every procedural maneuver and character assassination tactic they could. They tried to paint Danny as fragile and attention-seeking, his mother as opportunistic, and me as a rogue agent. But the evidence, particularly the video and Ms. Compton's testimony, was insurmountable. The resolution came nearly a year later after a grueling legal battle. Eleanor Vance was found guilty on both state and federal charges. The judge, in a scathing sentencing memorandum, spoke of the profound harm caused by her actions not just to Danny, but to the broader community and to the principles of equality and inclusion. She was sentenced to 3 years in a federal correctional facility, a significant sentence for a first-time offender, reflecting the gravity of the hate crime conviction. She was also ordered to pay substantial restitution to Danny's family for medical expenses, therapy, and emotional distress, and she was permanently barred from attending any event held in a federally funded public institution. Her husband's legal threats against me and the department had evaporated long ago, his bluster deflated by the mountain of evidence against his wife. For Danny, the journey of healing was long both physically and emotionally. His wrist required surgery, and he underwent months of physiotherapy. The emotional scars were deeper, but he was, as he had promised, a superhero. Supported by his incredible mother, his family, and an outpouring of love and encouragement from around the world, his story had gone global. He slowly regained his confidence. He returned to his passion for wheelchair dance. The state talent showcase organizers, deeply ashamed of the security lapse, invited him to perform as a special guest at the following year's event. He accepted. His performance, more poignant and powerful than ever, received a minutes-long standing ovation, not a dry eye in the house. The incident became a catalyst for significant change. My agency, the Federal Office of Public Event Integrity and Safety, used the Vance case as a template to develop enhanced training protocols for event staff nationwide on recognizing and responding to ableist incidents, protecting vulnerable performers and attendees, and ensuring true accessibility went beyond just physical ramps. New federal guidelines were issued, strengthening the enforcement of 80 provisions at public events. The community, both local and online, rallied around Danny. Fundraisers were held, messages of support flooded in. The ugly tide of ableist commentary was drowned out by a wave of solidarity and condemnation for Eleanor Vance's actions. The online forum she administered was shut down after public exposure. My role in the aftermath was to ensure that the lessons learned from this horrific event were translated into tangible improvements. I worked with state and local agencies across the country to implement better safety and inclusion standards. Director Harrison, initially cautious, became a staunch advocate for these reforms, citing the Vance case as a stark reminder of the ongoing need for vigilance. The final positive image that remains is not of Eleanor Vance's hateful scowl, but of Danny Miller back on stage, his smile radiant, his movements fluid and joyful, embodying courage and resilience. He didn't just overcome an act of violence, he became a symbol of hope and an inspiration for countless others. The sound of his wheels gliding across the stage, once a trigger for hate, was now a triumphant anthem of belonging, a powerful reminder that true talent knows no boundaries, and that the fight for justice, no matter how challenging, is always worth waging. The echoes of that day in the auditorium would linger, but they would be increasingly drowned out by the applause for a little boy who showed the world the true meaning of strength.